There's a purple blob. It weighs exactly 8.8 pounds. It can transform into anything. And according to one of the most enduring theories in Pokémon history, it's not just some random creature you catch on Route 14. It's the physical evidence of one of the darkest experiments ever conducted in the Pokémon world. A failed attempt to clone God. That purple blob, that's Ditto. And if this theory is correct, Ditto is what happens when you try to recreate perfection and fail spectacularly. But here's what makes this theory different from every other Pokémon conspiracy you've heard. The evidence isn't just compelling, it's everywhere. In the games, in the locations, in the numbers, in the colors. In Game Freak, they've stayed absolutely silent about it for almost 30 years. Before we dive deep into one of the most fascinating mysteries in Pokémon lore, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you ever suspect there was something more to Ditto? Have you noticed the connections we're about to explore? And if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into Pokémon lore, hit that like button and subscribe, because we've got plenty more theories and mysteries to uncover on this channel. Now, let's talk about how a simple transformed Pokémon became the key to understanding one of the franchise's darkest secrets. To understand why Ditto might be a failed Mew clone, we need to start at the beginning. Not with Ditto, not even with Mewtwo. We need to start with Mew itself, the ancestor, the origin. Pokémon number 151, the creature that, according to Pokémon mythology, contains the DNA of every single Pokémon in existence. Mew is not just rare, it's mythical. When Pokémon Red and Blue first released, players weren't even supposed to know it existed. The developers at Game Freak added it to the game in secret, tucking it away in unused space in the cartridge's code. No official strategy guide mentioned it. No in-game NPC told you how to find it. It was a ghost story, a playground rumor, the ultimate secret that everyone whispered about, but almost nobody could prove. And that secrecy, that mystery, it wasn't just a marketing gimmick. It was baked into the very lore of what Mew represents. According to the diary entries scattered throughout the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, Mew was discovered on July 5th in the jungles of Guyana, South America. Deep in one of the most biodiverse and least explored regions on Earth, a team of researchers found something that shouldn't exist. A creature containing the genetic blueprint of all Pokémon. On July 10th, they officially named it Mew. And on February 6th, everything changed. Because that's when the diary reads, Mew gave birth. We named the newborn Mewtwo. Those words are chilling when you really think about them. Mew gave birth. Not we successfully cloned Mew. Not we created Mewtwo from Mew's DNA. The phrasing suggests something more organic, more natural than the violent genetic manipulation we see in the first Pokémon movie. It suggests that whatever happened in that laboratory on Cinnabar Island, it wasn't a straightforward cloning process. It was something messier, something that involved multiple attempts, multiple failures. And here's where Ditto enters the picture. But before we get there, we need to understand who wanted this experiment to happen in the first place, and why. Giovanni isn't just a crime boss running a protection racket in Viridian City. He's a strategic mastermind attempting to corner the entire Pokémon-related technology market. Look at Team Rocket's operations throughout Kanto and the pattern becomes clear. They take over Mount Moon to steal fossils, which can be resurrected at the lab on Cinnabar Island. They establish a criminal front at the game corner in Celadon City to generate untraceable income. They invade Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town to steal Pokémon. They infiltrate Sylph Company to gain access to the Master Ball and advanced research capabilities. Everything Giovanni does is aimed at controlling the means of Pokémon production, manipulation, and capture. And the ultimate expression of this strategy is creating Pokémon from scratch. If you can manufacture Pokémon, you don't need to catch them. You simply engineer exactly what you need. This is why the Mewtwo project represents Giovanni's endgame, a Pokémon more powerful than any naturally occurring species that could be controlled, that exists solely to serve its creator's will. Except it didn't work out that way. Mewtwo rebelled, the laboratory burned, but before Mewtwo, there would have been prototypes, test subjects, and failures. The diary entries show us Mew was discovered on July 5th and named on July 10th. Then nothing until February 6th when Mewtwo is mentioned. That's a 7-month gap with no documentation. 7 months of experimentation that left no paper trail in the entries we can find. 7 months is a long time in scientific research. 7 months is dozens or hundreds of experiments. And what do we know about scientific cloning, both in the real world and in fiction? It's not a one-and-done process. You get failed attempts, incomplete copies, genetic material that can't maintain proper form. This is where Ditto becomes more than just interesting. It becomes logical. Let's talk about what makes Ditto so unusual. At first glance, it's a novelty Pokémon. Its entire battle strategy revolves around one move, transform. In combat, Ditto copies its opponent's appearance, moves, and stats. It's a perfect mimic, except for one crucial detail. It keeps its own HP. This makes Ditto simultaneously one of the most interesting and most useless Pokémon in battle. It can become anything, but it'll always be a weaker version of what it's copying. But here's what's fascinating. In the entire Pokémon franchise, across all 1025 species created over 9 generations, only 2 Pokémon can naturally learn the move Transform, Mew, and Ditto. That's it. Not Zoroark with its illusion ability, not the shape-shifting legendary Pokémon. Just these 2. The ancestor of all Pokémon, and a common blob you can catch in your 20s. Doesn't that seem strange? Now let's look at their physical characteristics. Both Mew and Ditto are pink. Their normal sprites in the early games share a nearly identical shade of pink. Sure, Ditto's sprites sometimes skew more purple, but the base color palette is remarkably similar. But here's where it gets really interesting. Their shiny forms. When you encounter a shiny Mew, it's light blue. When you encounter a shiny Ditto, it's also light blue. Not just similar, the exact same shade. In a franchise where shiny colors are usually unique to each species or evolutionary line, this color matching is extraordinary. The numbers tell an even stranger story. According to the Pokédex, Mew weighs 8.8 pounds. According to that same Pokédex, Ditto weighs 8.8 pounds. Now, Pokémon come in all shapes and sizes. There are Pokémon that weigh 2,204 pounds like Groudon. There are Pokémon that weigh 0.2 pounds like Ghastly. Weight distribution across the 1025 Pokémon species is wildly varied. Yet here we have 2 Pokémon that share the exact same weight down to the decimal point. And before you say, well, lots of Pokémon probably share weights, let's check. In Generation 1, only 3 Pokémon share that exact 8.8 pound weight class: Mew, Ditto, and Bellsprout. That's suspiciously specific. 3 Pokemon out of the original 151, and 2 of them just happen to be the only Pokemon that can naturally learn Transform. The statistical probability of this being coincidence gets smaller and smaller the deeper we look. Their biological characteristics reveal even more connections. Both Mew and Ditto are genderless. Both are capable of asexual reproduction in the wild, though we never see this happen directly in the games. Both have perfectly balanced base stats across all categories. For Mew, every stat is 100. For Ditto, every stat is 48. This perfect balance is extremely rare in Pokemon design. Most Pokemon have varied stats that reflect their strengths and weaknesses. Attackers have high attack or special attack. Tanks have high defense or HP. But Mew and Ditto, their stats are distributed with mathematical precision. It's the kind of deliberate design you'd expect from creatures that aren't naturally occurring. Creatures that were built, not born. But the most compelling evidence isn't in the numbers or the colors or even the moves, it's in the locations. Where you find Ditto tells a story all by itself. In Pokémon Yellow, Ditto appears in exactly 2 locations in all of Kanto: the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island and Cerulean Cave. Let's talk about why these locations are absolutely crucial to understanding this theory. The Pokémon Mansion is ground zero. This burned out, abandoned building on Cinnabar Island is where researchers discovered Mew's DNA and conducted their experiments. Every single diary entry about Mew and Mewtwo's creation comes from this location. The place is literally littered with the documentation of genetic experiments, scientific equipment, failed research, and wild Ditto roaming the halls. Think about that for a moment. This isn't some random route where you might find any number of Pokemon. This is the specific location where Mew was studied, where Mewtwo was created, where genetic manipulation was conducted on the DNA of the ancestor of all Pokemon. And the wild Pokemon you encounter there aren't Rattata or Pidgey, they're Ditto, blobs of seemingly failed genetic material that can transform but nothing more. In the original red and blue versions, Ditto didn't appear in the Pokémon Mansion at all. That was added specifically in yellow. Game Freak made a conscious decision to place Ditto in the one location most associated with Mew's capture and Mewtwo's creation. That's not an accident, that's a deliberate choice. They put the evidence right there in the game for anyone paying attention to find. But it gets even better with the second location. Cerulean Cave, also known as Unknown Dungeon in the original games, is where you find Mewtwo after defeating the Elite Four. This cave is Mewtwo's refuge. After escaping from the laboratory, after destroying the Pokémon Mansion in rage, Mewtwo fled to the deepest, most dangerous cave in Kanto. It's a place filled with high-level Pokémon, a labyrinth that tests even champion-level trainers. And guess what else is in Cerulean Cave? Ditto. Lots of Ditto. Now, you might argue that Ditto appears in other locations too. Routes 13, 14, 15, and 23 in the original games all have wild Ditto encounters. But here's the thing, those are all late game routes. Areas you don't reach until you've already progressed significantly through the story. And even then, the encounter rates are much lower than in the Pokémon Mansion or Cerulean Cave. The pattern is clear. Ditto appears most commonly in locations directly connected to Mew and Mewtwo. It's not scattered randomly across Kanto like Rattata or Pidgey. It's concentrated in 2 specific, story-relevant locations: the laboratory where the experiments took place, and the cave where the successful experiment went into hiding. Game Freak has always been brilliant at environmental storytelling. They don't need to spell everything out in dialogue or explicit text. They show you through placement, through context, through the world itself. And the world is screaming that Ditto is connected to the Mew experiments. But let's address what might seem like the biggest problem with this theory. If Ditto is a failed Mew clone, why is it so common? Why can you find dozens of Ditto throughout Kanto and later regions? Shouldn't failed clones be rare? This actually strengthens rather than weakens the theory. Remember that 7-month gap in the diary entries? That's potentially hundreds of cloning attempts. If even a small percentage of these attempts resulted in viable but imperfect clones, you'd have dozens of Ditto. And here's the crucial detail. These clones would be able to reproduce. Ditto is famous in the breeding mechanics of the games for being the universal breeding partner. A Ditto can breed with nearly any Pokémon regardless of species, producing an egg of the non-Ditto parent. This breeding ability is actually more evidence for the theory. If Ditto contains Mew's genetic material, even in an incomplete or unstable form, it makes sense that it could breed with any Pokémon. Mew is the ancestor of all Pokémon, containing all of their DNA. A failed clone of Mew might retain that genetic compatibility even if it can't maintain Mew's perfect form. So you'd start with dozens of Ditto produced by failed experiments on Cinnabar Island. Those Ditto, being genetically compatible with other Pokémon, could reproduce and spread. The original population serves as patient zero, the epicenter of a spreading population. A single Ditto escaping from the Pokémon Mansion could breed with wild Pokémon on nearby routes. A trainer catches a Ditto on Cinnabar Island, travels to Johto, and it escapes or is released. Over time, Ditto populations would establish themselves across multiple regions. And here's the telling detail. Look at where Ditto appears in later generations. In Gold and Silver, 3 years after Red and Blue, Ditto appears on Route 34 in Johto, notably after you've traveled through most of the region. They're not common early game Pokémon. In Ruby and Sapphire they appear in the desert underpass, a hidden area not accessible until late in the story. In Diamond and Pearl, they're in the Trophy Garden, a special area where rare Pokémon appear on rotation. Game Freak consistently treats Ditto as something unusual, something that appears in special circumstances. More tellingly, in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which remake the original Generation 1 games, where does Ditto appear? The Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island and Cerulean Cave. The exact same locations as the original theory suggests. Game Freak had the opportunity to change Ditto's spawn locations anywhere in Kanto for convenience or game balance, but they kept them in the 2 locations most closely associated with Mew and Mewtwo's story. That's a deliberate choice. That's Game Freak maintaining the connection even in a modern remake. The epicenter would still be the Pokémon Mansion and Cerulean Cave in Kanto, but scattered populations would appear wherever Ditto successfully bred with local Pokémon populations. By the time of Gold and Silver, 3 years have passed. That's 3 years for Ditto populations to breed and spread across Johto. By Hoenn, Sinnoh, Unova, and beyond, Ditto has become naturalized across the Pokémon world. The geographic distribution isn't random, it's archaeological, it's evidence of origin. Another argument against the theory points to Ditto's behavior and intelligence. Mewtwo is a genius, a philosopher, a being that questions its own existence and humanity's right to create life. Ditto is, well, a blob. It doesn't speak telepathically. It doesn't show signs of advanced intelligence. It just copies things. But this difference actually makes sense if Ditto is a failed clone. The whole point of a failed experiment is that it didn't work. Mewtwo represents the successful attempt to not just clone Mew, but enhance it, create something even more powerful. The cloning process worked perfectly, producing a Pokémon with Mew's genetic potential, plus additional power, and crucially stable form. Mewtwo can maintain its physical body, its sense of self, its consciousness. Ditto can't. A Ditto can transform and temporarily become other Pokémon, but it always reverts. It has no stable form of its own beyond that basic blob shape. It can't maintain complex thought patterns because it can't maintain complex biological structures. In essence, Ditto has Mew's core ability to adapt and change, but none of the stability that makes Mew what it is. It's like a photocopy of a masterpiece painting where all the colors ran together. You can see hints of what it was supposed to be, but the execution failed. If Mew is the ancestor of all Pokemon, containing every possible genetic combination, then cloning it would be extraordinarily complex. You'd need to not just copy the DNA, but copy it in a way that preserves all of Mew's abilities, its shape-shifting capabilities, its genetic flexibility, its perfect balance. And if you failed, if the clone couldn't maintain a stable form, if it could transform but nothing else, you'd end up with something that looks an awful lot like Ditto, an amorphous blob that can temporarily copy other Pokemon, but always reverts back to its shapeless state. A creature that weighs exactly what Mew weighs because it has Mew's genetic structure, but can't maintain Mew's form because the cloning process was imperfect. Trying to copy Mew's genetic code would be like trying to photocopy an entire library. Maybe your first attempts only capture a few books. Maybe you get the structure of the library but none of the actual contents. Maybe you get fragments that don't quite connect properly. Each failed attempt would produce something different. Some might be completely non-viable, breaking down immediately, but some might be stable enough to survive, even if they can't fully express Mew's capabilities. Those stable failures would be Ditto. They got the transform ability, they got the base genetic structure, they got the weight, the genderlessness, the breeding compatibility, but they didn't get the complete package. They didn't get the ability to maintain complex forms. They didn't get the intelligence. They didn't get the legendary status. There's another aspect to consider. What happened to all these failed clones after the Pokémon Mansion was destroyed? The diary entry on September 1st tells us Mewtwo became too powerful to control. Other sources tell us Mewtwo destroyed the laboratory in rage upon learning the truth of its creation. This is why the Pokémon Mansion is a burned out ruin when you visit it in the games. But what about the failed experiments? What about the dozens or hundreds of Ditto that were likely kept in containment? They would escape. In the chaos of Mewtwo's rampage, with the mansion burning and the researchers fleeing, any living creatures in the facility would get loose. Wild Pokemon already inhabited the mansion, as we can see from the encounters with Rattata, Raticate, Coughing, Wheezing, and Grimer when we explore the ruins. Those Pokemon were probably research subjects or guard Pokemon for the facility. Add in dozens of experimental Ditto clones, and suddenly you have an explanation for why Ditto are found throughout the ruined mansion. They're not there by chance. They're there because that's where they were created, and when the facility fell, they simply never left. Some might have wandered into the nearby roots. Others might have somehow made their way to Cerulean Cave, perhaps following some instinctive connection to Mewtwo, the successful version of what they were supposed to be. The game doesn't explore this connection, but it's worth noting that in Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo makes its home, Ditto are common wild encounters. Mewtwo chooses to live surrounded by these failed copies. Is that coincidence? Is it some form of kinship? Is it a reminder of what it could have been? The game leaves this unspoken, but the environmental storytelling is there. There's something profoundly sad about Ditto when viewed through this lens. Imagine being a failed copy of the ancestor of all Pokémon. Imagine having the potential to be anything but only being able to maintain that form temporarily. Imagine being cast aside, abandoned, left to wander the ruins of the place you were created because you weren't good enough. Every time a Ditto transforms, it's attempting to be what it was designed to be, a perfect copy. But every time it reverts back to that shapeless blob, it's failing again. It's living with the constant reminder that it wasn't successful. It wasn't Mewtwo. And yet, despite this tragedy, Ditto has found its place in the Pokémon world. It might not be the strongest, it might not be legendary, but it's useful, it's valued. Breeders all over the world rely on Ditto to help produce eggs of rare Pokémon. Ditto might be a failed experiment, but it's not a failed Pokémon. It carved out its own niche in the ecosystem. In its own way, Ditto succeeded by surviving, by adapting, by being useful in ways its creators never intended. But there's one person who might remember. One person who would carry the weight of what happened in that laboratory for the rest of his life. And if you've explored Lavender Town carefully, if you've talked to the residents and paid attention to what they don't say as much as what they do, you might have noticed something strange about the kind old man who runs the Pokémon Volunteer House. Mr. Fuji isn't from Lavender Town. Everyone knows this. The townspeople gossip about it. One NPC explicitly states that Mr. Fuji came from somewhere else, though nobody seems to know exactly where. He's beloved in Lavender Town for his kindness to orphaned and abandoned Pokémon, but there's a mystery in his past that he never discusses. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, there's a photograph on the wall of the Pokémon lab on Cinnabar Island. When you examine it, the text reads, "A photo of the lab's founder, Dr. Fuji." That question mark and exclamation point are doing a lot of work. The protagonist recognizes this person. They're surprised to see him here. And by the time you reach Cinnabar Island in those games, you've already met Mr. Fuji in Lavender Town. The implication is clear even if it's never stated outright. Dr. Fuji, the founder of the Pokémon Lab on Cinnabar Island, and Mr. Fuji, the kind old man who cares for orphaned Pokémon in Lavender Town, are the same person. In Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, this connection becomes even more explicit. Blaine, the Cinnabar gym leader, tells the player that the Pokémon Mansion still holds the remnants of his old friend's research. Blaine has a photograph in his gym showing him standing shoulder to shoulder with someone, both of them grinning. That someone is Mr. Fuji. In Pokémon Masters, Blaine directly states that he and Fuji used to research Pokémon together on Cinnabar Island. Now think about what that means for the Ditto theory. If Dr. Fuji was the lead scientist on the Mew cloning project, he would have been there for every experiment, every attempt, every failure. He would have seen dozens of Ditto-like creatures produced before Mewtwo finally succeeded. He would have been the one making decisions about what to do with those failures. And when Mewtwo destroyed the laboratory in rage, when everything fell apart, Dr. Fuji would have been responsible, not just for Mewtwo's creation, but for all the failed attempts that came before, for all the Ditto that escaped into the wild, or were abandoned in the chaos. The weight of that guilt would be crushing. You created life for the express purpose of serving as a weapon. You failed dozens of times, producing creatures that couldn't fulfill their intended function. And then when you finally succeeded, your success destroyed everything. So what do? You can't undo it. You can't bring back anyone who died. You can't uncreate Mewtwo or the failed Ditto. All you can do is try to atone, and that's exactly what Mr. Fuji does. He leaves Cinnabar Island, the site of his greatest failure and his most terrible success. He travels to Lavender Town, a place associated with death and remembrance. Pokémon Tower is there, where the souls of deceased Pokémon are laid to rest. It's the perfect place for someone seeking redemption, someone who needs to remember what they've done and dedicate their life to making amends. Mr. Fuji establishes the Lavender Volunteer Pokémon House, taking in orphaned and abandoned Pokémon, caring for creatures that have been hurt or discarded by others, giving them safety and love. Think about the symbolism of that. Dr. Fuji created Pokémon and then abandoned them when they didn't meet his standards. The failed clones were discarded. So Mr. Fuji spends the rest of his life taking in discarded Pokémon and giving them worth. He can't undo what he did to Ditto or Mewtwo, but he can save other Pokémon from abandonment. It's atonement through action. It's redemption through service. In the games, when Team Rocket kills a Marowak at Pokémon Tower and Mr. Fuji confronts them about their abuse of Pokémon, there's extra weight to that confrontation if you know his history. Mr. Fuji knows exactly what it looks like when Pokémon are treated as tools, as experiments, as means to an end rather than living beings with value. He lived that reality. He was that person. And now he stands against it with everything he has. That's the behavior of someone seeking redemption. Someone who has seen the worst that humans can do to Pokémon and is desperately trying to balance the scales. And when you rescue Mr. Fuji from Team Rocket, when he gives you the poke flute and asks you to wish for the happiness of all Pokémon, not just your own, there's a profound sadness in that request. He knows what it's like to value only specific Pokémon, only the ones that meet your standards. He knows what happens when you view Pokémon as successes and failures, rather than as living beings deserving of care. The connection between Dr. Fuji and Mr. Fuji transforms the Ditto theory from speculation about failed experiments into a complete tragic narrative. We have the creation, Mew discovered in Guyana. We have the ambition, clone Mew to create the ultimate Pokémon. We have the process, multiple attempts, multiple failures, the production of dozens of imperfect Ditto. We have the success, Mewtwo, powerful and conscious and angry. We have the destruction, the Pokémon Mansion burned, the laboratory destroyed. We have the aftermath, Ditto escaping into the wild, Mewtwo fleeing to Cerulean Cave. And now we have the consequences. Dr. Fuji becoming Mr. Fuji, spending the rest of his life trying to atone for what he created and what he abandoned. It's a complete story, and it's told almost entirely through environmental details, NPC dialogue, and connections between locations. Game Freak never explicitly confirms it because they don't need to. They've given us all the pieces, but the story of Cinnabar Island's experiments doesn't end with biological failures or human guilt. There's another consequence of what happened in the Pokémon Mansion, one that exists not in the game world's physical reality, but in the code itself. One that appears when you surf along the eastern shore of Cinnabar Island, performing a specific sequence of actions that shouldn't logically produce anything unusual. And what appears is something that shouldn't exist at all. A glitch, an error, a missing number. MissingNo. Everyone who played Pokémon Red and Blue has heard of MissingNo. It's arguably the most famous glitch in video game history. The corrupted tower of pixels that appears when you perform the Old Man glitch. The creature numbered 0 in the Pokédex. The entity that duplicates your 6th item when encountered. Think about where MissingNo appears. To encounter it, you watch the Old Man's catching tutorial in Viridian City, then fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along the eastern coast. That coast, that specific strip of land on Cinnabar Island, the same island where the Pokémon Mansion stands, the same location where Ditto appears in the ruins, the same place where Mewtwo was created and everything went wrong. MissingNo haunts Cinnabar Island specifically. The technical explanation for MissingNo's appearance involves memory management and tile coding errors. That's the factual explanation. But here's what makes the theory compelling. In a narrative sense, MissingNo, appearing specifically on Cinnabar Island's coast, is perfect. Too perfect to be purely coincidental. This is the island where scientists tried to create Pokémon through artificial means, where they manipulated genetic code to produce new life forms, where experiments failed and succeeded in equal measure. And now, decades later, the island is haunted by a creature made of corrupted code, a creature that exists in the space between valid and invalid data, a creature with Pokédex number 0, as if it predates all other Pokémon, or exists outside the normal numbering system entirely. MissingNo shares some fascinating characteristics with the biological experiments we've been discussing. Like Ditto, MissingNo can appear in multiple forms. The most common is the backward L-shaped glitch sprite, but it can also appear as fossil Pokémon sprites, or as the ghost sprite from Lavender Town. Like the failed clones that might have had varying levels of stability or completion. MissingNo has different manifestations depending on specific variables. The name itself is suggestive. MissingNo, short for missing number, like a clone that was supposed to have been created but wasn't completed. Like experimental data that existed briefly before being deleted, like the gap between failed attempt number 37 and successful creation number 150. If you're creating dozens of prototype clones before achieving Mewtwo, those prototypes need identification numbers. And when they fail, when they're abandoned or discarded or escape, those numbers go missing from the official records. They become MissingNo. The fact that encountering MissingNo duplicates your 6th item is also narratively appropriate. Duplication, cloning, creating multiple copies of something from a single original. That was the entire point of the Pokémon Mansion experiments. Create copies of Mew, duplicate its genetic information, and MissingNo, whether intentionally or coincidentally, duplicates. Not Pokémon, but items. Not perfectly, but glitchily, corruptedly, as if the process itself is flawed. As if the code remembers what Cinnabar Island was for, what purpose it served, and continues trying to duplicate things long after the laboratory burned down. Some players who perform the missing number glitch report permanent damage to their save files, corrupted graphics, Hall of Fame data replaced with glitched sprites, Pokémon with impossible stats, the game becoming unstable in ways that persist even after MissingNo is released or deleted. These consequences mirror exactly what happened with the biological experiments. Creating MissingNo, even accidentally through a glitch, has permanent effects on your game. Creating Mewtwo and Ditto had permanent effects on the Pokémon world. In both cases, you can't undo what's been done. You can only live with the consequences. The connection to Lavender Town adds another layer. MissingNo can sometimes appear with the sprite of the ghost Pokémon from Pokémon Tower, the same tower where Mr. Fuji tries to comfort the souls of dead Pokémon, where death and memory are central themes, where the consequences of human actions against Pokémon are most visible. If MissingNo merger represents the deleted data of failed experiments, it makes sense that it would be connected to both Cinnabar Island, where the experiments occurred, and Lavender Town, where those who feel guilt about Pokémon suffering go to remember and atone. Is MissingNo literally the digital remnant of Dr. Fuji's failed experiments? Of course not. On a technical level, MissingNo is exactly what it appears to be, a glitch caused by programming oversights. But here's the beautiful thing about this theory. It doesn't matter whether it's intentional. What matters is that it's narratively resonant. Game Freak created a world where genetic experiments on Cinnabar Island went wrong, where failed clones might exist, where the consequences of playing God with Pokémon persist long after the laboratory burned down. And in that same world, in that same location, a glitch appears that functions as a perfect metaphor for those failed experiments. MissingNo is to the game's code what Ditto is to the game's biology. An error, a failure, something that shouldn't exist but does. Something incomplete that persists anyway, something that appears most commonly in the location most associated with experimentation and creation gone wrong. MissingNo completes the Ditto theory in a way that's almost poetic. Ditto represents the physical legacy of the experiments, the biological failures that survived and spread. MissingNo represents the digital legacy, the data corruption that can't be fixed, the scars left on the game's code by experiments that, even in fiction, had consequences the creators couldn't fully control. And both are found in the same place, encountered through exploration of the same location, connected to the same tragic story of ambition and failure and consequences that persist long after everyone thinks the disaster is over. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Cinnabar Island represents what happens when humans try to play God with Pokémon, when they view Pokémon as resources to be manipulated rather than beings to be respected. The experiments produce Mewtwo, powerful and angry. They produce Ditto, numerous and forgotten. They produce Mr. Fuji's crushing guilt. They produce ruins and ghosts and glitches. They produce consequences that spread across regions and persist across generations, and can't be undone no matter how much anyone wishes they could be. But the Cinnabar experiments aren't unique in the Pokémon world. Looking at the bigger picture reveals something unsettling about Kanto. It's not just a region where kids catch cute creatures and battle gym leaders. It's a technological hub where the boundaries between natural and artificial life have been systematically eroded. The Pokémon lab on Cinnabar Island deserves particular attention. This facility is responsible for resurrecting fossil Pokémon like Omanyte, Kabuto, and Aerodactyl. The technology to take ancient DNA and reconstruct a living organism already exists in the Pokémon world. You can witness it yourself by bringing fossils to the scientists working there. They'll take your fossil, perform some kind of genetic reconstruction process, and hand you back a living, breathing Pokémon that's been extinct for millions of years. Now, if the technology exists to resurrect extinct species from fossilized DNA, what would stop those same scientists from attempting to clone a living species from fresh genetic material? The answer is nothing. The technology is already there. The infrastructure exists. The scientific knowledge has been demonstrated. And according to in-game documents found at Sylph Company, the Pokémon lab on Cinnabar Island created Porygon, the world's first virtual Pokémon. This is explicitly stated in the games. The lab doesn't just resurrect fossils, it creates entirely new forms of Pokémon life. Porygon represents a different approach to artificial Pokémon creation through pure computer programming, but it proves the lab was actively engaged in creating novel Pokémon. Porygon's existence proves that creating artificial Pokémon is not only possible, but actively pursued by corporations in the Pokémon world. The technology exists, the infrastructure exists, the willingness to experiment exists. So when Mew's DNA was discovered in Guyana, when the opportunity to attempt cloning presented itself, the Pokémon lab on Cinnabar Island was the obvious choice. They already had the infrastructure, they already had the expertise, they'd already proven they could manipulate genetic material to create living Pokémon. The leap from resurrecting fossils to cloning a living specimen isn't that large. It's the same fundamental technology applied to fresher material. And this raises an uncomfortable question. How many other experiments were conducted on Cinnabar Island that we don't know about? We know about Mewtwo because it succeeded spectacularly and then destroyed the facility. We can theorize about Ditto because the evidence is scattered throughout the games. We know about Porygon because it's explicitly attributed to the lab. But what about the experiments that failed completely? What about the genetic material that didn't survive long enough to escape into the wild? What about the projects that were quietly shut down and never documented in any diary we can find? The Pokémon Mansion is a ruin. Most of the documentation was destroyed when Mewtwo burned it down. The diary entries we can find are fragments, snapshots of specific dates with massive gaps in between. We're seeing the tip of the iceberg. The full scope of what happened on Cinnabar Island might never be known. But Ditto isn't the only artificial Pokémon in Kanto. Look around the region and you'll find others. Voltorb and Electrode appear in places like the Power Plant and Pokémon Mansion. And according to Pokédex entries, they were first seen at a Pokeball factory. They're described as Pokémon that somehow resemble Pokeballs, first discovered when Pokeballs were invented. The implication is clear. Voltorb didn't exist before humans created Pokeball technology. They're either artificial creations, or Pokémon that evolved in response to human technology. Either way, they're not naturally occurring in the traditional sense. Grimer and Muck are similar. Their Pokédex entries explicitly state they were born from sludge exposed to X-rays from the moon. They're pollution Pokémon, created by industrial waste. Kanto's rapid technological development literally produced new species of Pokémon. The region's ecosystem has been fundamentally altered by human activity. Magnemite and magneton appear near power plants and electrical facilities. While not explicitly created by humans, they're Pokémon that thrive in artificial environments that seem to require human technology to exist. You don't find them in forests or mountains. You find them in cities, in power plants, in places where humans have built electrical infrastructure. Kanto isn't just a region where humans and Pokémon coexist naturally. It's a region where the line between natural and artificial has become blurred beyond recognition. And the Pokémon Lab on Cinnabar Island sits at the center of this transformation. It's the place where humans took their technological ambitions to their logical extreme, creating Pokémon from scratch. But Kanto's experiments with artificial Pokémon weren't the last. Game Freak has continued this theme throughout the series, and each new generation has given us new examples of Pokémon created through human intervention. And the pattern they follow is disturbingly consistent with what we theorize happened with Ditto. Team Plasma in Generation 5 created Genesect. Take an ancient bug-type Pokémon, modify it with cybernetic enhancements, add a cannon to its back. It's explicitly described as a modified Pokémon, altered by human science to become a weapon. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same goal Giovanni had with Mewtwo: create the ultimate Pokémon through artificial means. The difference is that Team Plasma didn't try to create something from scratch. They started with an existing Pokémon and enhanced it. But the motivation is identical. Create a Pokémon more powerful than nature intended, one that exists solely to serve human purposes. Type, Null, and Silvally from Generation 7 are even more relevant to our theory. These Pokémon were explicitly created by the Ether Foundation as an attempt to combat Ultra Beasts. The Ether Foundation took genetic material from multiple Pokémon types and combined them into a single synthetic organism. They were trying to create an artificial Pokémon capable of matching the threat level of creatures from another dimension. And here's the crucial detail: they failed multiple times. Type, Null isn't the first attempt. It's one of 3 prototypes that survived the creation process. The other prototypes were either unstable or destroyed. Type, Null wears a control mask because without it, the Pokémon's power becomes uncontrollable. It's literally a failed experiment that's kept in check by restraints. Does that sound familiar? Failed attempts at creating a powerful Pokémon through genetic manipulation. Multiple prototypes, most of which didn't survive or weren't viable. The successful versions requiring external controls because they're inherently unstable. This is the Ditto theory playing out explicitly in the modern games. Game Freak is showing us that what we theorize happened on Cinnabar Island isn't speculation. It's how artificial Pokémon creation works in this universe. You make multiple attempts. Most of them fail. The ones that succeed are often unstable or dangerous, or require significant containment measures. Type, Null is what Ditto would look like if Game Freak explicitly confirmed the theory. It's a failed experiment that survived. It's one of multiple prototypes. It exists because scientists tried to create something powerful and got something incomplete instead. The only difference is that Type, Null's status as an artificial Pokémon, is explicitly stated in the games, while Ditto's status remains unconfirmed. But the pattern is identical: failed cloning attempts, multiple prototypes, unstable results. And most tellingly, these Pokémon still have value despite being failures. type, Null can still evolve into Silvally under the right conditions. Ditto can still breed with any Pokémon and serve crucial functions in the ecosystem. Neither of them became what they were designed to be, but both found their own place in the Pokémon world. Anyway, the Ether Foundation's experiments with type. Null happened decades after the Cinnabar Island incident. Different region, different organization, different goals, but the same methodology, the same willingness to manipulate Pokémon genetics, the same pattern of failure and partial success. It suggests that what happened on Cinnabar Island wasn't unique. It was the template. It was proof of concept. If you want to create artificial Pokémon in the Pokémon world, you follow the Cinnabar model, gather genetic material, attempt synthesis, expect multiple failures, contain the results. The key difference is that by Generation 7, this kind of experimentation is acknowledged openly. The Ether Foundation doesn't hide what it's doing. Type, Null's existence as an artificial Pokémon is documented. But back in Generation 1, back on Cinnabar Island, everything was secret. The experiments were conducted covertly. The diary entries were hidden. When Mewtwo destroyed the laboratory, the evidence burned with it. All that remained were rumors, scattered Ditto, and a researcher so consumed by guilt that he fled to Lavender Town to spend the rest of his life atoning. The progression across generations tells a story of normalization. In Generation 1, creating artificial Pokémon was a dark secret that ended in catastrophe. By Generation 5, Team Plasma modified Genesect openly as part of their stated goal to liberate Pokémon. By Generation 7, the Ether Foundation conducts genetic experiments with synthetic Pokémon as part of an officially sanctioned program to protect the Alola region. What was once hidden has become standard procedure. What was once a cautionary tale has become accepted practice. And Ditto remains the evidence of where it all started. The living proof that Kanto's experiments in artificial Pokémon creation came at a cost. Every Ditto you encounter, every time you use one for breeding, every time you watch it transform and then revert back to its blob form, you're interacting with the legacy of Cinnabar Island. You're using the failed prototypes of an experiment that should never have been conducted. But here's what makes this theory truly fascinating. Game Freak has never confirmed it. They've never denied it either. For almost 30 years, they've maintained absolute silence on whether Ditto is related to Mew and Mewtwo's creation. And that silence is deafening. They could easily debunk this theory. One line in a Pokédex entry, one NPC dialogue, one official interview where a developer says, "No, Ditto is just a naturally occurring shapeshifter." But they haven't. Instead, they've continued adding evidence that supports the theory. In every remake of Generation 1, Ditto's spawn locations remain tied to the Pokémon Mansion and Cerulean Cave. When they remade the games for the Game Boy Advance with Fire Red and Leaf Green, they added the photograph of Dr. Fuji in the Pokémon Lab. When they remade them again for the Nintendo Switch with Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, they expanded Blaine's connection to Mr. Fuji and the Pokémon Mansion research. Each new version of Kanto adds more context, more connections, more evidence. They're not moving away from this theory. They're leaning into it. And the patterns continue in new generations. Every time they introduce a new artificially created Pokémon, it follows the Cinnabar template. Failed attempts, multiple prototypes. ethical concerns about playing God with Pokémon genetics. The cautionary tale that started with Mewtwo and Ditto gets retold with Genesect, Type, Null, and other synthetic Pokémon. Game Freak keeps returning to this theme because it's central to the Pokémon world's relationship with technology and nature. The refusal to explicitly confirm the Ditto theory serves a purpose. It allows the theory to exist in the space between canon and phenon, where it can be explored and discussed without being definitively resolved. It's the same approach they take with other dark elements of Pokémon lore. Are the ghost-type stories about dead Pokémon real, or just legends? Was the war mentioned in Lieutenant Surge's dialogue an actual conflict? What really happened to Kubone's mother? Game Freak gives us enough evidence to theorize, enough connections to make compelling arguments, but never quite enough to close the case completely. This ambiguity is intentional. Pokémon is, on its surface, a cheerful franchise about kids going on adventures with cute creatures. But underneath that surface, there are darker elements. Experiments gone wrong, Pokémon being treated as tools, organizations that view Pokémon as resources to be exploited. The Ditto theory lives in that darker layer of Pokémon lore. The layer that's always present but never explicitly confirmed, because doing so would fundamentally change the tone of the franchise. If Game Freak officially confirmed that Ditto are failed Mew clones, they'd be confirming that dozens of living creatures exist only because scientists discarded them as inadequate. They'd be confirming that the cute blob Pokémon everyone uses for breeding is actually a tragic figure that lives in the shadow of its own failed purpose. They'd be making explicit the ethical horror that the theory implies, that humans in the Pokémon world have been creating and discarding life based on whether it meets their standards of usefulness. That's heavy. That's dark. That's not the message Game Freak wants to send overtly in games marketed to children. So they do what they've always done. They give us the evidence and let us draw our own conclusions. They create a world where this theory makes perfect sense, where all the pieces fit together, where the pattern is clear to anyone paying attention. But they never quite say it out loud. So what does all of this mean? What's the takeaway from the Ditto theory? On one level, it's a fascinating piece of video game archaeology. It's players taking the scattered pieces of environmental storytelling, Pokédex entries, character connections, and game mechanics, then assembling them into a coherent narrative. It's a testament to how much depth Game Freak built into these games, how much care they put into creating a world that rewards close attention and careful thought. But on a deeper level, the Ditto theory is about failure, identity, and finding purpose despite not being what you were meant to be. Ditto was supposed to be Mew. It was supposed to be the ancestor of all Pokémon, the perfect being containing every genetic possibility. It was supposed to be legendary, powerful, unique. Instead, it's a blob. It can copy other Pokémon temporarily, but it always reverts. It can't maintain the forms it's supposed to embody. By every measure of its intended purpose, Ditto is a failure. And yet, Ditto found its place anyway. It became invaluable to Pokémon breeders. It established viable populations across multiple regions. It adapted to environments and situations its creators never anticipated. It survived not by being what it was designed to be, but by being what it actually is. A flexible, adaptable creature that can temporarily become anything but doesn't need to maintain that form forever to be useful. There's something profound in that, something hopeful, even in a theory about failed experiments and abandoned clones. Ditto wasn't successful according to the parameters set by the scientists on Cinnabar Island, but it was successful according to its own existence. It carved out a niche. It survived. It thrived in its own way. And maybe that's the real message hidden in the Ditto theory. Not that Game Freak is telling a dark story about genetic experiments gone wrong, though they are. Not that Pokémon lore has hidden depths that reward careful analysis, though it does. But that failure to meet someone else's expectations doesn't mean you've failed at existence itself. That being discarded as inadequate by your creators doesn't determine your worth. That finding your own purpose, even when it's not the purpose you were designed for, is its own form of success. Mewtwo was the success story, the perfect clone, the enhanced being, the Pokémon that exceeded even Mew's legendary status in raw power. And Mewtwo spent its entire existence tormented by questions of identity, purpose, and whether life artificially created has meaning. The first Pokémon movie explores this explicitly. Mewtwo's whole arc is grappling with its own existence, trying to find purpose when you weren't born but made. Ditto doesn't have that crisis. Ditto just exists. It doesn't question. It doesn't rage against its creators. It doesn't wonder whether its life has meaning. It just lives. It adapts. It breathes. It helps trainers achieve their goals. It found peace in a way Mewtwo never could, precisely because it wasn't successful enough to be burdened with consciousness of its own artificial nature. There's a tragedy in that, certainly. Ditto doesn't know it's a failed experiment. It doesn't carry the weight of what it was supposed to be. But there's also a strange kind of grace. Ditto escaped the curse of success. It's not powerful enough to be dangerous. It's not intelligent enough to question its existence. It's not rare enough to be hunted or exploited. It's just a Pokémon, common and useful and accepted, living its life without the burden of its own origin story. Mr. Fuji understood this, perhaps. That's why he dedicated his life to caring for abandoned and discarded Pokémon. Not because they succeeded at being what humans wanted them to be, but because they exist and deserve care regardless of whether they meet anyone's standards. Every Pokémon in the Lavender Volunteer House is there because Mr. Fuji believes their existence has value independent of their utility. He learned that lesson the hardest way possible, by creating life, judging it inadequate, and then living with the consequences of that judgment. The Ditto theory, in the end, is a ghost story, not the kind with chains and cold spots, but the kind where the past refuses to stay buried, where decisions made decades ago echo forward through time, where a purple blob swimming in the waters off Cinnabar Island carries with it the weight of scientific ambition, human error, and the enduring question of what we owe the lives we create. Game Freak hasn't confirmed this theory. They probably never will, but they've given us everything we need to see it, if we're willing to look. The evidence is in the game mechanics, the spawn locations, the Pokédex entries, the character connections, the environmental storytelling, and the persistent themes that appear across 30 years and 9 generations of Pokémon games. Ditto weighs 8.8 pounds, so does Mew. Ditto can learn Transform, so can Mew. Ditto appears in the Pokémon Mansion where Mewtwo was created. Ditto appears in Cerulean Cave where Mewtwo fled to hide. Ditto has the same shiny coloration as Mew. Ditto has perfectly balanced stats like Mew. Ditto can breed with any Pokémon like Mew theoretically could. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is clear. The story is there, written in the game's code and geography and design choices. Whether Game Freak intended it or not, whether they'll ever confirm it or not, the Ditto theory is the most coherent explanation for a series of coincidences that are too specific, too consistent, too thematically appropriate to be purely accidental. And so Ditto remains what it's always been, the living proof of a failed god. The evidence of experiments that went wrong, the consequence of ambition untempered by wisdom, the 48 imperfect clones that escaped into the wild when the laboratory burned, the purple blob that wasn't good enough to be legendary, but was good enough to survive. It transforms into your Pokémon, copies your moves, fights with your stats. And then, after the battle ends, it reverts. Back to that shapeless form. Back to being Ditto. Not Mew. Never Mew. Just a Pokémon that exists in the shadow of what it was supposed to be. Living proof that failure can still mean survival, and that sometimes being a copy that can't quite maintain the original form is enough. The mansion still stands on Cinnabar Island, burned and ruined and haunted by the ghosts of scientific ambition. Mewtwo still lurks in Cerulean Cave, powerful and angry and alone. Mr. Fuji still cares for abandoned Pokémon in Lavender Town, atoning for sins the games never explicitly name. And Ditto still swims in the waters off Route 13, common and unremarkable, and absolutely everywhere. The theory will never be confirmed, but it also will never go away. Because once you see the connections, once you understand the pattern, you can't unsee it. Every Ditto you encounter becomes part of the story. Every transform animation becomes a reminder of what these creatures were supposed to be and what they became instead. And maybe, in the end, that's exactly what Game Freak intended all along. Not to tell us a dark story about failed experiments, but to give us the pieces and trust us to put them together ourselves. To create a mystery deep enough that almost 30 years later, we're still analyzing the evidence, still making the connections, still telling each other about the purple blob that weighs exactly 8.8 pounds. Because that's what makes Pokémon special. Not just the creatures themselves, but the world they inhabit. A world with depth and history and consequences. A world where scientific experiments have ethical costs. A world where the past doesn't stay buried. A world where even the failed experiments, the abandoned prototypes, the discarded clones, find their place eventually. Ditto found its place in the breeding centers, in the wild populations across 6 regions, in the hearts of players who recognized that this unassuming blob was more than it appeared to be, in the theory that refuses to die because the evidence is everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the games. So next time you catch a Ditto, next time you use one to breed a rare Pokemon, next time you see that purple blob transform and then revert, remember what you're looking at. You're not just seeing a Pokemon with a useful ability. You're seeing the legacy of Cinnabar Island, the living proof that when humans try to create life for their own purposes, the results rarely match their intentions. You're seeing a creature that failed to be God but succeeded at being itself. And in the Pokemon world, where friendship and acceptance are core themes, where every creature has value regardless of its strength or rarity, where even the smallest Caterpie can become a champion's partner, maybe that's the most Pokemon message possible. That failure to meet someone else's standards doesn't determine your worth. that finding your own place in the world, even when you weren't supposed to exist at all, is its own kind of victory. Ditto is the living proof of a failed god, but more importantly, Ditto is proof that failure isn't the end, that survival is its own success, that existing outside the categories others created for you is possible, that a purple blob weighing exactly 8.8 pounds can carry more meaning than any legendary Pokémon, precisely because its story was never meant to be told. Game Freak gave us the evidence, the fans assembled the theory, and Ditto just keeps on existing, transform and reverting, common and invaluable, failed and successful, the ancestor of nothing and the partner of everyone, forever swimming in the waters off Cinnabar Island where it all began, where the experiments went wrong, where the laboratory burned, where Mewtwo escaped, where Mr. Fuji's greatest mistake scattered into the wild and became something nobody expected. The theory is complete, the evidence is everywhere, and the purple blob remains, as it always has been, exactly what it is, Ditto, the transformed Pokémon, number 132 in the Pokédex, the failed copy of number 151, the living legacy of human ambition, the common Pokémon that should have been legendary, the creature that wasn't good enough to be God, but was good enough to endure. And 30 years later, we're still talking about it. We're still analyzing the evidence. We're still making the connections. We're still telling each other about the purple blob that weighs exactly 8.8 pounds. Because the best stories in Pokemon aren't always the ones they tell us directly. Sometimes they're the stories we discover ourselves, hidden in the game mechanics and spawn locations and diary entries, scattered through a burned mansion on an island where scientists once tried to play God with Pokemon DNA. The Ditto theory lives in that space between canon and fanon, between explicitly stated and cleverly implied, between what Game Freak confirms and what they allow us to discover. And it endures because it's not just a theory about a Pokemon's origin. It's a story about failure and success, creation and consequence, ambition and atonement. It's a story about what happens when you try to copy perfection and end up with something that's somehow both less and more than you intended. Ditto is that something, and as long as Pokemon games exist, as long as players pay attention to the details and wonder about the implications, the theory will persist. Not because Game Freak said it was true, but because they built a world where it could be true, where all the pieces fit, where the evidence tells a story they never had to write down. That purple blob weighs exactly 8.8 pounds, and it's still the most compelling mystery in Pokemon history.